it on? I'd like to introduce Jack Peirce, and he's going to give us a talk about the history of Witch Hill, which we find will be of interest to all the people of Topsfield and other people in surrounding communities also. So, Mr. Peirce, maybe you could, Jack, maybe you could start in.
I'd be delighted to. I've lived on this hill all my life, and I'm deeply attached to it, and I do know something of its long history. Originally, in the early 1600s, this hill, a large portion of it, was set aside to the Isaac Esty family. Isaac Esty married, I can't say, the Topsfield witch. There were 3 town sisters, and they were of course educated. They could read and write, which was rather a rarity in the early 1600s, and they may have been rather pronounced in letting people know their feelings on things. But Mary Esty was, she did not live up here. She and Isaac lived in a house down in the Coolidge field that lies across Main Street from the co-op. And her son lived in the house on the site of what we used to call the big house, now belongs to the Cheevers. That house, or rather the original house, was built in the early 1600s by the Estes, and part of the foundation still exists in the southwest corner, which shows in the picture that we'll look at later. How do I know that it's the old foundation? Well, that corner is, the foundation is this wide. It's made up of rough stones and plastered in. And that corner of the cellar is shallower than the rest of it. It just fits with the idea of having been a very shallow cellar, not unlike the foundations under the Capon House. Mary Esty was arrested and spent one summer in the Salem jail, and then was released, possibly due to one letter which she wrote to the General Court. The following spring, she was again arrested, and she was at that time visiting her son up on Witch Hill. The name Witch Hill had been assigned to the place because there was somewhere a meteorite, and the story got around that Mary held her witches' sabbaths around the meteorite. I wish the meteorite was still around, but I expect that somebody broke it up, hoping to dispose of that story and get that out of the way. I don't know what happened to the place after the Estes moved out. The Esty family, incidentally, are still around. They run a lumber yard up in Groveland. The town sisters, 3 of them you see, were executed under that witch scare, and the towns were around. Benjamin Town was an early member of the Cheese and Crackers Club, and his son is still in the area. There were towns living on the corner of Hill Street and Garden Street up until 20 years ago. Anyway, in the early 1800s, Witch Hill was bought by Benjamin W. Crowninshield of the merchant family of Salem. I don't know when they bought it. I'd like to think that it was just prior to the War of 1812. you know the Peabody family bought Glen Magna in Danvers. They were also Salem merchants, and they bought Glen Magna with the idea of having a spot back from the shore where they could escape if the British occupied Salem. I wonder if Crown and Shield didn't buy Witch Hill for that same purpose. It would be interesting to check up with the date of his purchase. Anyway, he owned the place until his death, which was in the 1840s, it was in the 50s, 1850s, because we have the Crown and Shield stone down on Garden Street, which carries the Crown and Shield coat of arms, and on the back has the initials BWC and the date 1853. That was the time, just about the last moment of his occupancy. He then sold the place, I believe, to Dr. Boyden, who had a prize stock farm up here, and then my grandfather bought it in 1853. My grandfather came from Dover, New Hampshire, where he ran a coastwise shipping business, but the ships were getting too big for the Piscataqua River, and the prosperity of that area of Rockingham County and that was both industrial and rich farming was receding. So he moved his business to Boston. And according to one of the family stories, one reason that he bought Witch Hill was that he could get into town over the turnpike on only one change of horses. And can we break? Okay. Of course, in 1853, the Newburyport Turnpike was still a toll road, and it was 1 lane wide. It was a gravel road up until, I believe it was a gravel road up until 1919. My mother came here in 1910 as a bride, and she told me that when they had friends coming down from Boston during the mud season, they used to send the farm wagons over to the south side of the hills to pick the friends up, because the cars of those days couldn't take the mud getting over the hills. The turnpike, of course, didn't exist. The turnpike was started in 1805, and Crown and Shield, when the turnpike was built, Crown and Shield put a driveway down from the house to it, which ran straight down the hill. It isn't the present driveway. There were elms that had been planted on both sides of it, but it came straight up and was extremely steep. The present driveway was redone in the 1870s by Bowditch and curves in a very handsome manner. And that gives it more length and, of course, an easier grade. Where do we go from here? Can we occasionally cut things out as you edit?
We can.
Well,
Now, were you born here, Jack?
no, I was born in Boston. I was born in February. And in those days, mothers liked to avoid going to the hospital because of childbed fever and so forth. And mother's obstetrician lived in Boston, so she had to spend the winter in Boston. But I was then brought up here and spent all of my youth here.
Jack, your story the other day about your grandfather entertaining Jefferson Davis up here was
All right.
interesting.
That gives me a lead on. That's jumping somewhat. Well, we'll pick that one up. You see, my grandfather had this trading business with sailing vessels, sailing up and down the East Coast. And as a boy, this would have been in the 1840s, he sailed out to Texas. And he was mightily impressed with the possibilities of the brand new frontier of Texas, and developed contacts down there and developed his business down there. Then the Civil War came along and it practically bankrupted my grandfather. I suspect that he was a copperhead. A copperhead was a northerner who sympathized with the South. Anyway, he kept his contacts in Texas, and one proof of that is that at the end of the Civil War, Jefferson Davis, you know, was put in chains and locked up in Fortress Monroe in Virginia, and the vice president, I can't say his name at the moment, it may come to me later, and the vice president of the Confederacy was confined on George's Island, the fort out in the middle of Boston Harbor. When the vice president was released after about 6 months of imprisonment, where did he come? He came down here and spent the weekend with my father on Witch Hill, my grandfather, which is interesting. And that shows that grandfather had kept his contacts in with the South. He and some friends then went down and bought up a bankrupt railroad, the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio. Houston, of course, had not been thought of, not been settled in those days. Harrisburg was a railroad junction, which now is just a minor suburb of Houston. But he bought up this railroad and then rehabilitated it and started building his rails to the west. He named the route the Sunset Route. Meantime, Huntington was building the Southern Pacific lines east. Finally, they met a little west of El Paso, and my daughter-in-law has the Silver Spike that joined the waters of the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. We comment in the family that she may have the Spike, but Huntington got the railroad. In the 1870s, you see, grandfather was president of this railroad. He spent his winters in Texas and his summers up here. Franklin Balch, who was our town moderator for so many years, told me that he had attended the one-room school which used to exist down the turnpike, just abutting the Witch Hill field, and while he was, I guess, a young teenager, the school was allowed to go through grandfather's private car, which was parked on the siding down in Topsfield. And Franklin there had his first view of a Negro. The steward, of course, was a Negro. Balch also said that in grandfather's last illness, he arranged to have the oxen. There were 3 or 4 spans of oxen in the farm in those days, paraded around the driveway. And Balch happened to be up here and saw the parade. But in the 1870s, Grandfather hired Ernest Bowditch, who was a nationally known civil engineer. There weren't landscape architects in those days, to landscape the place. You see, the wing had been built, I think I've already covered this, the wing had been built on the wrong side of the house, and the thing was pretty gawky. Bowditch wanted to accomplish 2 things. He wanted to establish a terrace on the turnpike side to be sort of a base to the house. He needed fill for that.
Shall we put the picture up at this point?
Yes.
Can you describe it without seeing the...
Well, I may want to point to things. Why don't I just
Okay.
That's good.
come out? This picture, I like to say, is the picture of the place in its glory days. It was the center spread of a county atlas published in 1884. The center spread is noted, there's a line down the middle of it showing that it was part of a big volume. Here is the old house, and this is the corner that dates back to the Estes. This is the wing which got on the wrong side and left the house so that the cook who lived up in this 3rd floor back corner was the only one who had a good view of the valley. Bowditch added the terrace here, which is a more prominent structure actually than it looks in that picture, but he needed fill for it. Now you see this bank along here, the natural slope of the hill, these contours went across there, so he dug out this whole area here, provided the fill for the terrace, and at the same time developed a parterre for a big formal garden and hedges around it. You see, these were little spruce trees. They were developed eventually into a clipped hedge, typical landscape feature of many Victorian places. But after Grandfather's death, somebody forgot to prune them one year, and now they're 70 feet high. Of course, we've lost many of them, but there are still some handsome trees out there. Bowditch did the U driveway. He built the greenhouse. This was the potting shed of the greenhouse and is now my dining room. I have a wing out this side and another wing out back. Down here is the Crowninshield stone, which I've spoken of previously. That is still there, and maybe we'll pick it up with a picture later on. Dub it in. In the glory days, when they had VIP visitors, I'm told that in one of these beds they set out the visitor's initials in appropriate flowers. He also did a much more considered planting than the little fellas that exist here, and some of those trees still exist. Many of them, there's some beautiful big purple beeches. A few tall spruces are still left. The elms, there was a double row of elms down here flanking the original driveway, and they have all gone due to Dutch elm disease, but we have other trees. Bowditch also dug out the pond, which is down in the valley, and developed a spring in the valley which pumped water up to an 8,500 gallon wrought iron tank on the 3rd floor of this tower. That tank serviced all of this, the greenhouse, the farmhouse, and the farm across the street, with one of the biggest barns that there ever was in Essex County. Let's break for a moment. The water system that Bowditch put in, of course originally the place survived on shallow wells which would dry up every summer. Bowditch developed this stoned up spring that is 13 by 26 feet. Originally there was a pump house over it and a naphtha driven steam pump. That blew up one day. The building burned down. A windmill was substituted, and that proved rather ineffective, I suppose, simply because the wind didn't blow constantly. Then my father converted to a gasoline pump, which lasted until after World War II. At that point, we had to do some major repairs to the old wooden tower. So we elected to tear the tower down and substitute pressure tanks, and electric service. In the days when we lived on the gasoline pump, operating it was something of a problem. In the wintertime, the stableman would get up early in the morning, put on his snowshoes, go down the valley, down into the valley, open the pump house, start a fire. He'd then come up, have his breakfast, feed the horses, again put on his snowshoes, go down, turn on the valve, start up the pump, and go up the hill, do his chores, and he kept an eye on this tower. When that huge tank got full, it would overflow. And then he'd again put on his snowshoes and go down the hill, shut all the valves, and drain everything so that it would survive. He had to do this once a week. That 8,500 gallons handled this place and the farm for a week. And we didn't have controls as to exactly how much water there was in it. But we were pleased to. We didn't have any stablemen after World War II. The formal gardens, my mother was a great gardener, and she did her best with the formal garden, but not having a full-time gardener, it was a major project for her. She used to, during the summertime, she would say, every week I weed one of those beds. Then when my stepfather, Howard Brown, joined the family, he took up rose gardening, and the two of them developed a beautiful rose garden in the foundations of the old greenhouse here, which are directly off of my dining room. That is still there. I haven't time for rose gardening, so I'm afraid I will have to. It's a beautiful thing, and I've had to simplify it with hedges and planting that looks after itself pretty well. Not as well as I'd like, but I don't have the time to do that with everything else. Well, the place stayed in our family until 1946. My mother had died, the family had split up. The house was too big for any one of us to consider using, and I had my own. It was bought by Dr. Benjamin Riggs because it would have been a fine house for him to live in with 3 servants. But strangely enough, he didn't have 3 servants. It had a basement kitchen, other impractical features. The Riggses moved out after a few years, and my cousin Cornelia Marian and her husband Browning Marian was a selectman for several years, after much cogitation bought it. As their architect, I removed the north wing that had been put on the wrong side of the house. I removed the cupola. Previously, I had removed this porch and built a 2-column Greek portico porch instead. The Marians improved the house in some ways. They added green blinds, took out the 4-light Victorian windows on the front and substituted the original 12-light windows, and moved the kitchen upstairs in a much more practical situation. The stable remains very much as it is now, but there were 3 stalls added on this end and a washstand in the early days. There was a, behind here, in my stepfather's day, we had a 7-car garage, which we called the Motor Mart. And at times there were a dozen cars on this place. Think how many there would be today if we had the same population. Well, at maximum, the Peirce farm extended for 450 acres, and the land was on across the street. The barn was across the street, and the land extended down to Danvers, to Locust Street, down by the reservoir there. We sold the farm off in the middle of the Depression. We'd had a joint farming arrangement with a man, and he came up and said he couldn't handle it anymore, and we sold it. So we were back then to 100 acres on this side of the road, and kept those until the water board came along and took over the valley by eminent domain, so that someday there will be a reservoir, or there may be a reservoir. The water board has the land. I don't know whether the reservoir will actually be ever built, because the Little Ipswich River is a highly stressed river, and so many towns draw their water from it. And if Salem and Beverly do develop this reservoir, they would have to have their allowance for water increased, and they may not be able to do it. But it would be a good use for the valley. So there we are. The place has been in our family for close to 150 years, and I hope that this corner of it may stay for another generation. Is that enough for you? Okay. Across the turnpike, on part of the old farm, there are 2 Peirce graves, now on land that is owned by the Salem Beverly Water Board. One of them is the grave of Lucy Davis Peirce, born in Dover, New Hampshire in 1830, died in 1872. The inscription on the stone reads, "Until the day breaks and the shadows clear away." I believe that Lucy died of smallpox. Therefore, she could not be buried in the town cemetery and was buried on this hillside. The second grave is that of Julie Mathilde Prignan, born at Asterfort, France in 1863 and died in 1905. The inscription, "She was my grandmother's French maid and later served my aunt Marion Peirce Pentecost." The inscription on that stone is in French, but I'll give you my translation of it. "The Lord, having seen her, was touched with compassion towards her, and he said to them, 'Do not weep any more.' She loved God, the flowers, the stars, the green fields." When and if the reservoir is built, those graves will be underwater. I would like to see them. I already have an agreement with the Salem-Beverly Water Board that they be moved over to land on this side that is still Peirce. And I just hope somebody will be around to follow through on that, because I may not be here.
Jack, that house, the old farmhouse across the street, was that part of the Peirce property also?
Oh, yes.
But it is no longer part of the Peirce?
No, we sold that in the middle 30s. And it is a very simple building. It's entirely too close to the street. And
I can
should
remember
just-
the barn.
yes,
That
it
was
was a big one.
huge barn.
It was a huge barn. It housed 100 head of cattle. You could drive a full loaded hay wagon up a ramp into the big barn and down and around the corner, stopping to unload your hay in the big lofts. In addition to 100 cows, originally there were 3 or 4 span of oxen. My father kept a bull there. And then there was a lower level. You see, the floor of the barn was essentially at ground level. And then underneath there was a croft where they stored wagons and such. So it was a huge structure and a very handsome one. And it was quite a fire. What else? What shall we do?
What, do they ever know what caused that fire? Was it-
No. I was having supper with the Marines when somebody heard loud crackling noises, looked out the window and could see the flames. I rushed out and I thought immediately of getting the cattle out. Well, there was no question of getting any cattle out at that point. Fortunately, the cattle were not in it. They were all out, and there were no loss of life there. At one point, the firemen finally arrived, and I directed them down to the pond, and they ran a hose up the turnpike to fight it, but it didn't do any good, of course, except it kept it from burning the farmhouse down.
That's a beautiful field there.
And then I grabbed a helmet off the fire truck while I was rushing around. Later on I found out it was the fire chief's helmet. Well, we have had there was a family statement that there's always something doing on the hill.
It used to be talk that Mary Esty was buried privately. No one ever knows where she was buried after she was hanged as a witch. And they used to say they thought that her son might have taken her back here to be buried. Did you ever hear that?
I don't know at all.
I've heard
Incidentally,
that before. We always wondered about.
have we got her 2 letters to the General Court?
I think somewhere there in one of the books that we have
Yeah.
that she
The
wrote.
second one is a perfectly wonderful letter.
Yes.
It was written during her second incarceration, and it in effect says, "I know it's too late to save me and my friends. We've already been convicted, you see. But for gosh sakes, why don't you wise up and stop all this troubling innocent people and drop this spectral evidence? You know, this children testifying to the witches flying around and so forth." So it's a grand letter, and she deserves to be remembered
Yes,
by it.
because it was very instrumental in there. There were no more witches hanged after that. Was that correct? It seemed as if it really.
The
very prominent about
scare had run its course, but you see it was spreading.
Yes.
Originally it was Danvers. You know, originally it was a result of a feud between the Putnams and the Town family, and each was claiming the other was cutting trees down the Blindhole Swamp on the other's land. And that may well have been so, you know, because boundaries weren't very clear in those days.
Right.
They hadn't had time to build the stone walls.
Yes, and at that time they were having a lot of witchcraft in Europe too, I read some.
Oh yes. Well, it had gone on. It had gone on. It wasn't anything new, but I think eventually, when they began finding witches up in Andover, up in Newburyport, and so forth, they decided this had just gone too far.
Right.
I don't know that Cotton Mather, who'd been one of the instigators of it, ever apologized for his performance, but at least he stopped pushing it. For a while, I had a church bell on my front lawn. My grandfather had built a church in Dover, New Hampshire in memory of his parents. Betsy Wentworth was his mother. And there is he. If you want to swing the camera on those later on, dub it in. He gave it to the local Universalists. And of course that group thinned out, eventually joined with the Unitarians, and even that congregation got smaller and smaller. They were wholly unable to keep the church up. Well, I had a copy of the deed of gift which stated that if they ever gave up using the church for regular religious services for more than 2 years, I or my heirs, this being my grandfather, may enter upon and retake the property. Well, I've forgotten how many years later, but it's 60-some years later, 18 heirs had to act under that deed of gift. They wished to have us sign off our interest so they could sell the property. Instead, we took them to court and established our ownership. Meantime, they had removed the stained glass windows from the building and the pews. I salvaged some of the pews, 5 of them had been removed and left in the basement. I salvaged those and gave them to the Essex County Greenbelt Association, where they're an important fixture in the Greenbelt's barn in Essex. the bell, eventually we sold the property to the bank next door. The church was to be torn down to make a parking lot. I brought the bell down here, otherwise it would have been melted down. I brought down the trusses in which it was hung and built a little structure under it, which structure still sits out there. But after it had been here for 20-odd years, Trinity Church had a bell. Rot had gotten into their bell tower. The bell had been removed until the church decided what to do about the tower. Before they could make any decision, somebody came up one night and put the bell in a truck and trucked it off and melted it down.
No, I didn't know that either.
They got $5,000 of insurance. So I gave them my bell and used the $5,000 to design a somewhat simplified, and I designed a simplified tower to support it. I was careful to get the tower built out of pressure treated wood, so presumably it won't rot out this time. It was fun to add that tower to Trinity Church because of course I'd been the architect for it back in the late 50s. My daughter Lucy was the first wedding in the church. The land for Trinity had been given by Bill Coolidge, and I remember when we had you know, had never been an Episcopal congregation in Topsfield, but when one was organized in the early 50s, when it was organized in the early 50s, we eventually got to the point of having a fundraising dinner. And everybody got up and made the usual speeches. And there was a good deal of enthusiasm. And finally, Bill Coolidge got up and he had a bit of a lisp when he was emotionally excited. And that bothered him this time. But he said, and when all your pledges are in, I will match them. And he did.
Yes, I remember that. Does the bell, do they ever ring that?
I don't know that. I have not heard it run.
No, I haven't either, so.
I want to get a path leading out to the bell tower and onto the street,
Oh, yes.
which would be better when we have huge crowds and people are parking on the street,
Yeah.
they could walk in that way.
That would be nice.
So that would get done someday.
Did you design any other churches besides Trinity, Jack?
Yes, I did one in Stoneham, the Church of All Saints, and those two are the only churches. On the local scene, I was always, for many years, pro bono consultant, architectural consultant for the Historical Society. I put a new roof on the Parson Capon house in, I think it was 1947. Now, wooden roofs are supposed to have a life of about 20 years. That roof is now ready to be replaced. It has served for more than 50 years. How did it do it? Well, I chose redwood shakes, which were not available to Parson Capon. I got the independent nail company in Bridgewater to give us some stainless steel annular ring nails, which were also not available to the parson. And then I laid the shingles up as if I were making a slate groove, interleafing a row of 60-pound paper with the row of shingles. So virtually the paper has been keeping the house dry, and now there isn't much left. But 50 years is pretty good age for redwood. I also added that very small library wing to the Parson Capon house. When the Capon house was restored in 1912, the second floor was not restored, and it was made an apartment so that a custodian lived there. And to get to the apartment, he was provided with a set of stairs out back. They looked like a set of stairs that might have been on a tenement in East Boston. But that was what I started with. I tried to pull that thing together and added the little library beyond. I have my Parson Capon house, of course, we all love it the way it is, and yet it is not true to what was there originally. I went through the house once with Thayer Cummings of the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, and he showed me certain dowel marks in the main framing that indicates that instead of that very nice 9-window, 1-door, simple orderly facade, it had a much earlier Tudor type of windows, similar to the Whipple House in Ipswich. We don't talk of this too much. Also, the George Francis Dow was an antiquarian, self-taught, very opinionated, and full of enthusiasms. He was enamored of a door that he saw out in Deerfield, built of vertical boards on the outside and horizontal boards on the inside, all held together with wrought iron nails at quite frequent intervals. And he put that sort of door up there. It's a lovely door, very appropriate. But I think the original door was down cellar 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, when I was more concerned with the Capon house, and that was a 6-panel, typical colonial door. I'm not suggesting we should change the Capon house front, but we ought to realize that it is a bit of a fake. What else can I give you?
Well, see, there's the schoolhouse replaced by the town building, which you designed. Is that correct, Jack?
Yes. Yes, that is correct. Schoolhouse Hill, the old Topsfield Academy,
Right.
was located on top of that hill, and we needed a firehouse, and we needed a garage for the highway department. So I became the architect for an equipment building. I was looking this up a year ago. The appropriation for that entire building, including architect's fees, was $13,600. We say inflation is slow and under control. It had proved wholly inadequate, of course. The town has grown. Fire engines are larger than they were then. Trucks are larger. There are many more of them. And the building has been pretty badly abused. A new firehouse was built on High Street, of course. And now the highway department took over the firehouse end of the equipment building, and now they are building a new, that appropriation went through, didn't it?
I think so. You mean up at the Marino property?
Yes.
I think so.
A new thing that will be 3 times the size of that building.
I don't think it did pass.
I don't know.
I don't know whether it's gone through yet or not. I know.
Well, the
there's
town
been
is
so much
considering
time,
it.
yes.
That's right.
Been a
Well,
lot
it
of
was turned
time.
down the first time, I believe, but maybe
Yeah.
Yes.
it's still.
Oh, because of all these other expenses.
Because of
That's
all
right.
these other
Yeah.
colossal
Yeah,
expenses.
yeah, I think so. Because of the school.
It does seem ridiculous what we have to spend for things nowadays. Doing a $3 million addition to the library, for example. That original library was a George Francis Dow creation. WPA days. We didn't have any money. Somehow or other he got Waltersfield Kellogg, an architect, to draw some plans strictly on spec. But then Dow managed to get a WPA grant, and he had the plans, and the building got built. It was quite adequate to our needs at the moment. Now, I think our new library building is larger than we need, but if we are to get the state grant, it had to, the program had to be, well, the program was dictated by the state. And if it didn't go along with all the facilities, then we wouldn't have had the grant. And we're certainly just amazingly fortunate to have the Gould Fund come along at this juncture and pay 1/3 of this cost. The state pays 1/3, and the town it pays 1/3. That division is not accurate, but it's roughly so. So the town has changed a good deal. You know, I was chairman of the finance committee when I was a graduate student at MIT. And in those days, the town ran on a $3 million budget. That wouldn't, things have changed.
What are your recollections of the Marino property?
The Marino property originally belonged to the Hodges family, and if you go back to 1905, my aunt Marion, my father's sister, was living in Witch Hill. My father was living in the Ray Farm, where the Nike site is today. There was a federal early 18th century house over there, which must have been a lovely one, and a big barn. But that house burned down one night. The fire was started by one of the maids who was smoking. Thinking, how horrible idea. Later on, the barn burned down. I can remember seeing the flames from my bedroom window. That was 1917 when the barn burned. But when the house burned, about 1905, my father, who owned this, or at least had a life interest in this place, wanted to live here, and Marion had just gotten married to Captain Ernest Harvey Pentecost, RNR. He was a very British, always British man. He was a skipper for the Cunardas. So they built a brick mansion on top of Barrett Tor. That's what he named it. And eventually, when he sold the place, and it went to the Maryknoll sisters, it acquired that name. And then they added substantially to it a dormitory and a gymnasium. And there was a big stable too that was incorporated in these things. They never had a functioning disposal system. They had to have it pumped out every so often, because that's a gremlin with very poor percolation. But we like to think of it in those days with the Peirces on the south end of the valley and Witch Hill, and the Pentecosts on the north end.
That was beautiful in that area.
I was thinking about that when I went up to the recycle
I
Saturday.
know it.
There's nothing at all
All the
there
buildings
now.
were all taken down.
Yes.
Nothing there at all.
It was beautiful.
Those buildings still existed, because they had fires too. The old house had a fire in it. But I think when it finally was abandoned by the state, you know, the state bought it from Maryknoll and used it as a youth center, which apparently was not a success. And then they abandoned the whole thing, partly because of the disposal problem. I wanted to see the town take it over and use it as maybe as a junior high school. But I didn't have a solution to the disposal problem either.
Yeah.
How well did you know Mr. Proctor, Jack?
Not at all. He was my father's age, and they were friends up until 1919. Peter used to have a polo field, and my father played on it. But in 1919, the state proposed to take over the turnpike and make it a state highway, and that meant massive widening of the road and massive cuts through our hills, which my father, strangely enough, was greatly opposed to. He had an alternate scheme that the turnpike should take off as you're coming north. The turnpike should take off, where the Putnamville Reservoir is now, and go to the east, wind around all these hills, and then come back right up Perkins Row, right through the middle of Tom Proctor's place. Strangely enough, Peter Proctor opposed that, and there are stories of his doing some heavy politicking and Thanksgiving turkeys to get the votes out on his side in the town meeting, but we needn't go into all of that. Town meetings in Topsfield used to be gayer than they are now. There was one time when my father was active in town affairs, and the town meeting was going along, but somebody questioned the quorum. Did we have a quorum? They didn't have a quorum. So my father said, I'll go down, I see if there aren't a few young men hanging around the drugstore. So he went out and corralled handful of men at the drugstore and brought them up to the town meeting. They had a quorum, they reopened the meeting. Discussion went on for quite some time, and then it came to a vote. Somebody got up to question whether they still had a quorum, but the quorum had walked out.
About what year was that?
Oh, I think that would have been about 1920.
I see.
That was just a family story. The other town meeting story I like was of a later date. This was when I was at the meeting, and must have been in the 30s. There'd been a long discussion, and one man got up, though I won't say his name. He said, "Well, I'm deaf, and I didn't hear what the last speaker said, but whatever he said, it was wrong."
Sounds like Harrisburg.
You were right, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Oh my. Well, town meetings are a more orderly affair than that. Well, I think that's probably enough for your film.
Yes, thank you very much, Jack. And if we could finish this up by taking a picture of the stone and
Yeah.
and whatever else was of interest, that would be great.
Okay. This stone here, with the date of 1852 on it, was placed by Benjamin Crownshield following the lawsuit which had been ended by the Reddingtons and one other family to have Garden Street, originally a dead-end street, extended through to the turnpike. That was an interesting case. Daniel Webster the Younger would counsel on one side, the successful counsel with Rufus Choate, later the ambassador to the court of St. James, all arguing about Little Garden Street. It was named Garden Street because it ran right across where Crownshield had had his gardens. The place was then occupied, was then sold to a Dr. Boyden, who had a prize stock farm, and then in 1856 it was bought by my grandfather, including at its maximum about 450 acres, extending down to Danvers, including a good part of what is now the Putnamville Reservoir.